Hello, everybody. Good to be back with you by video today to continue our study in 1 Corinthians. And we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and looking at the second part of verse 10, so verse 10b through verse 13. Another short passage for us, but packed full of good stuff. And Paul has been spending so much time in the book of 1 Corinthians talking about wisdom and foolishness, and how the wisdom of the world is foolishness to God, but how the wisdom of God appears foolish to worldly people. And in the last passage that we looked at, then Paul introduced the idea of the wisdom of God as being something magnificent and beyond our comprehension. He called it something that no eye has seen nor ear has heard. And he said that it was something that goes even beyond our imaginations. It's not simply information or clever theories, as we often think about wisdom being in our concepts of it. It's something far beyond these, Paul suggests. And now he's closing in on the point of all of this wisdom and foolishness discussion, and trying to help us understand exactly why this is so important that we get our heads around this. And so in today's passage, we'll learn a little bit more about that. Let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 2, 10b to 13. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also, no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now, we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. Here we have it, don't we? The key of chapter 2 is that Christians, those who believe in God, who love Him, as he described there, those who are spiritual, can actually know God. We can have an intimacy with God. True wisdom looks like that. It's the knowledge of God Himself. Not just knowing about God, not just knowing facts or understanding philosophical concepts about God, but actually knowing God Himself and being known by Him. Now, how is that possible? Well, because of the Holy Spirit. Paul asks, who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person? Now, it's one of the great dilemmas in our world, is being known, isn't it? We all want to be known. We want someone to know us, to feel intimately connected to others. But we also fear being known too, don't we? Because we fear rejection and shame. And that goes all the way back to Eden, to Adam and Eve. That was where we first began to be introduced to this idea of knowing one another, being known, but also of being without shame. The Adam and Eve before the fall were described as being together, and they were described as being naked and not ashamed. They knew each other, and they understood one another. And they could anticipate each other's preferences and expectations. They could be truly naked before each other, not just in the clothing sense, but they could really be vulnerable together. And they were without shame. I think it's because they were without shame that they were able to be vulnerable with each other in that way. And then when they first sinned and were introduced to the knowledge of good and evil, then what happened? They hid. They tried to cover their nakedness with leaves. They tried to cover their guilt with blaming others. They became ashamed, and they didn't want to be known anymore. That fallen condition still causes us to wrestle with shame too, doesn't it? We want to be known, but our shame prevents us from being truly vulnerable. We want the intimacy of knowing others, but their shame prevents us from getting to know and see them for who they are. And likewise, we can never know God on our own, not because God is ashamed or has any reason for shame, but because the only way for us to know God would require an intimacy that we can't attain in our fallen state. But, Paul says, we do know God if we're believers because he has given us his Spirit. Verse 12 says that we, believers, have received the Spirit of God so that we might understand the things of God. Unless we shy away from this because of our shame, then the inverse is already true. God knows us intimately and nakedly, and he has already accepted us, and in spite of all the things that we might be ashamed of. He can accept us in spite of those things on the very basis of the gospel, because of Christ and him crucified, which was the very heart of the wisdom of God, as Paul taught in an earlier passage. And so we find in the Spirit the key to something astounding. Our relationship to God and our spiritual status in the world as prior to conversion are described in a lot of different ways. We're called children of wrath. We're called enemies of God. We're called strangers, those who are alienated in the world. We're called orphans. But God, through giving us his Spirit, makes it possible for us to know him in a true and profound way. And instead of being children of wrath, now we can know God as Father and children, and as children of God. Instead of being at enmity with God, now we are in fellowship with him. Instead of being estranged, now we are brought near to him. Rather than being orphaned, we are adopted into his family. So through the Spirit of God, then we come to know God and be known by him and to be in that intimate fellowship with him. Next week, we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into this and how the Spirit empowers us this way. This theme of the Holy Spirit, it becomes a major theme in the book of 1 Corinthians, and the Holy Spirit's work to draw us into who we are in light of his presence in our lives. So we'll look more into that next week. Thanks for listening.
Alas, and did my Savior bleed? Did my sovereign die?